nightmares.
Jane Dashwood is the most beautiful girl with huge eyes, an incredible smile and a loud laughter. This is how I will remember my sister. I will never forget how jealous I was of her debut. Balls, dances, gatherings, theatres, looks of utter admiration. She became the very first beauty of this season. Every day young guys came to us with gifts and flowers, trying to get at least a little of her attention. My envy disappeared when I heard some men jokingly use the phrase bride fair. In fact, this is how each new season was called, where women exhibited like a lot. Then I realised that Jane, like her girlfriends, was perceived as a commodity to be dressed up and decorated in order to be more profitable in marriage. This year, almost 1 in 3 girls set their sights on Mr. Radcliffe, a rich, handsome bachelor. John Radcliffe himself communicated more with the girls' parents than with them. He spoke quite often with our uncle Thomas Dashwood, who became our guardian after our parents' death. This year, our uncle did not skimp on the outfits for Jane. He knew he was making an investment that would pay off after the season was over. One evening, I heard Jane and our uncle arguing on the first floor of the house. "You didn't have the right to read this." After these words of my sister, I went into the room. Jane immediately went to her room, and my uncle hugged me and told me that everything was fine. After that quarrel, Jane became somewhat gloomy and reserved. In public, she talked with Mr. Radcliffe, showed that she encouraged his attention. Once I noticed that she was often bothered by a young man named James Brandon. He was one of Jane's admirers. He used to visit us often. He and Jane talked a lot. But it all ended. Jane grew cold towards the boy, who really was not destined to get her hand. Uncle would never allow Jane to marry an assistant judge who can only afford 1 room. These were the last days of my dear Jane's life. On the eve of her murder, her uncle said that the marriage with Mr. Radcliffe was almost a done deal. I noticed that she became more secretive, almost did not tell me anything, but often hugged and told me that she loved.
I love you.
She looked at me tenderly, as if saying goodbye. At the reception at the Duchess of Ashford's, Jane laughed again, danced a lot and had fun. The next day, my dear Jane was found in one of the streets of the city. Jane died from being hit on the head by a heavy object. Many thought, why did the killer leave her body on the street? Didn't even try to hide it somewhere. And after a few days, the news spread throughout the town that Mary Collins was getting married to Mr. Radcliffe. My grief and pain turned into anger and hatred. Did Mary Collins dare to get her hands dirty because she couldn't win what she wanted in a fair fight? All night I could not sleep. The thought that someone, perhaps Mary, stole my sister's happiness and life was not leaving me. The next day I visited Mary Collins. She was surprised, and her mother was behaving suspiciously. Everything in the house was as I remembered. The only thing I did not see was a nephrite elephant, which, according to Mrs. Collins, had been given to her by some prince from some eastern country. Even from the age of 12, it seemed to me that Mrs. Collins herself changed the name of the country every 6 months, as if she forgot what name she used to say. I asked where the famous elephant of which Mrs. Collins was so proud had gone. To which Anna Collins replied that she, with her pride in the elephant, was far from my uncle, who rushes to brag about his hunting trophies when the opportunity arises. When Mrs. Collins left the room, I immediately voiced my suspicions to Mary, who reacted sharply and even tried to send me away, saying that my sister was not as innocent and pure as she wanted to appear. Mary recently picked up a business card that fell out of Jane's bag. Mary came out of the room and brought me this business card of a place called Susie. It was a place where no decent woman appeared, let alone an unmarried girl. I went to Susie's. On the way, I turned the business card. There were some stains on it. At the facility, I spoke to one of the workers to see if he had seen my sister here. He immediately knew that Jane was the girl who had recently been found dead. I showed him the business card that Jane had, according to Mary. Unfortunately, he did not see Jane here. I was disappointed. Is all I have as a clue are some spots? I myself didn't realise that I mumbled it out loud. The man took my business card and said that it was a good clue. I just laughed and he called his thin colleague. He sniffed the spots, even licked one, which disgusted me, and immediately announced his verdict: mint schnapps. The men laughed that only one person drinks this abomination, and I couldn't stop looking at the thin man in amazement. They saw it and laughed again, saying that the thin man is a real connoisseur and expert who can tell by the smell what kind of wine a person drank an hour ago. I don't have never seen such talents, but hardly in my world of refinement it would be something beautiful. The men said that the only person who drinks this schnapps at their place is the judge's assistant. At home, I could not come to my senses. James Brandon is an admirer to whom Jane has grown cold. And what if this murder is not for profit? What if this murder is the revenge of a neglected boy? I realised that I had to talk to this guy. In the evening, I went into Jane's room hoping to find some more clues. It was difficult to touch her things. I wanted to leave everything in its place, as if she still lived here. After an hour of searching, I found a letter from James Brandon, where he wrote that Jane was an arrogant and terrible girl, that he felt nothing more. My attention was also drawn to her ballroom book, in which a certain Mr. Donbray was recorded for counterdance. I have never heard such a name among our acquaintances. Uncle entered the room. He started talking about how he also misses Jane, but the warm words ended there. He went on to say that if she had married Mr. Radcliffe, we would have been bathed in money. My uncle looked at me and said he had offered Mr. Radcliffe my hand, but he had refused. I then listened to my uncle criticise me for not being as pretty as Jane, but he was going to fix that next year, right before my debut. With this statement, he left the room. The next day I went to see Mr. Brandon. He was surprised by my appearance, but he did not kick me out, only scolded me that young ladies should not be alone with men, as if I didn't have enough lessons from my uncle. James was surprisingly very talkative. He showed me a letter from Jane, which was as cold as his letter to her. As it turned out, they both knew that the uncle was reading the letters Jane received and sent, so they came up with a kind of cipher where every third word had to be reversed, and Donbray was an anagram of his surname. They were supposed to meet at Susie's before escaping. Jane agreed to marry him and was not going to listen to her uncle's orders. When she didn't come to Susie's, James thought she'd changed her mind, and the next day, he learned that she was found dead on the street. I looked over Jane's letter, which he had. Already knowing the cipher, the handwriting was hers. My sister was madly in love with James Brandon. I told James that I wanted to find my sister's killer. We brainstormed together about who could do it. But each time we came back to Mary and Anna Collins. I said that the jade elephant could have been an instrument of murder. James and I had a plan. He was to distract Mary and her mother with a fictitious warrant from the judge so that I would have time to investigate. In Anna's room, in one of the drawers, I found the famous crashed elephant, which turned out not to be nephrite, but glass. Just the glass was qualitatively painted. No wonder she didn't let anyone touch him. I understood that such fragile glass could not be the cause of Jane's death. This elephant must have crashed here in the house, and there was no sign of blood. I also managed to find an interesting contract in Anna's papers, according to which she really almost sold her daughter. She has already received considerable amount from Radcliffe. These papers infuriated me. Are women in this world just a commodity? The dates of the wedding, additional conditions for the maintenance of the bride's mother were recorded as additional points. It was said that upon breaking off the engagement, Mrs. Collins was bound to repay all the money. Money is also returned in case of an accident or Mary's death. Did the uncle have the same contract with Mr. Radcliffe? And indeed, at home I found something similar. But unlike the contract with the Collinses, there was talk of returning the money only under the condition of breaking off the engagement. That is, the uncle has a lot of money left. Despite the fact that Jane did not marry Radcliffe, I began to think that if Jane had run off with James, then Uncle would have had to return the money. And what if he knew about my sister's plans? I looked around my uncle's office, and only now did I notice that one trophy was missing from his shelf. He bragged about his hunting competition awards so often that I knew what year each award was for, and now I see that there is one missing. I began to look at the floor. The carpet that had been laying in his study all the years that we lived with him went somewhere. On one of the shelves, I saw a small drop of blood. He got rid of the prize, the carpet, probably cleaned the floor, but he didn't notice this little drop. My uncle came into his office when I was sitting on the floor and looking at this drop. I was scared. To my surprise, he said that he had to do it, and he had to do everything in such a way that Jane's body would definitely be found, and there would be no rumours that she had run away. After all, he would have to return the money to Radcliffe. But his confession cost me my freedom.
No!
He made me a prisoner of his house, scaring me every day that I had to accept it and that I would not survive without his support. But the only thing that kept me going was my hatred for the man who killed my beautiful sister. I knew that I had to take revenge. I knew that the murderer must be punished. It took me a lot of time and cunning to escape from this house. I understood that none of the constables would listen to the young woman, and that my treacherous uncle would find salvation. But will he be able to save himself from such a powerful and influential person as Mr. Radcliffe? Do not think so. Mary, who had already become his wife, met me at Radcliffe's house, and it was her who persuaded him to listen to me. I could see on Radcliffe's face how sorry he was that my sister's life was taken just because she wanted to be happy. But later, that expression changed to anger because my uncle had cheated Radcliffe. Immediately after this conversation, I was sure that Radcliffe would make my uncle regret his despicable act for many, many years. Immediately that evening, I sailed on the first ship to Paris, where my distant relatives lived. And looking at the horizon, I knew I should be happy for myself and for Jane. My life is in my hands, and I will not be part of the bride fair.